And one of the results is that we can be here together, ready to learn and enjoy. With this being said, I turn to our host, Dr. Kirstin Jeffrey Johnson, who is a McDonald's scholar from Canada. She is co-editor in Informing the Inklings and member of the advisory board of Inklings Journal 7. She is the author of the forewords and afterwards to the Romanian translation of McDonald's The Green Key and Barfield's The Child and the Giant. She is the co-chair of the George MacDonald Society and the founding member of our society. And she directs the Linlaten events, Theology and Arts Conference and lecture series based on, in rural Ontario. So I invite her to introduce our guests and lead the conversation. And thank you so much, Kirstin, for being here with us.
Thank you, Denise. It's a delight to be here as always, and always so much fun to see different people's names and faces popping across the screen as we gather here and begin. Today, our C.S. Lewis Connected event is going to look a little different than usual because we've got a few more voices joining us, a few more stories weaving together. So I'll give you a little bit of a sense of the outline of how that is going to go, but thank you for joining us for this discussion. It's going to be a fascinating discussion of friends in co-inherence, a discussion of both the concept and the book by Dr. Paul Fiddes, his work. And I'm going to begin today, instead of giving you a general introduction to either Dr. Fiddes, Professor Fiddes, or to Charles Williams, rather to three of the scholars who are joining us. And then Dr. Bunaciu is going to introduce us to Dr. Fiddes and pull us more fully into an understanding of his work and the import of his work, the place of his work. And then Dr. Sorina Higgins, who is herself a Charles Williams scholar, is going to give us a bit more of a fuller understanding of Williams. I see there are a few Williams scholars here, but I know for many of you, he may be entirely new, or you may just know a little about that odd inkling, that other inkling, and wanting to know more. And Sorina is the perfect person to pull us into that. And then Dr. Michelson is going to give us a more fuller understanding of Professor Fiddes's new book and its place and role. And we'll carry on from there. There will be time for questions at the end, possibly not as much as usual, because we're going to be having some scholars, these scholars here providing and engaging with the questions, but we will have some at the end. And as usual, what I will do is ask you to send those questions to Agora Christie in the chat box, not to me. Feel free to natter questions and ideas that you have in the meeting chat, but if you just leave in the meeting chat, we won't see them because my focus is going to be on our speakers and on our special guests. So I won't see the questions, or that I'm not good at following the chat and being present here at the same time. So send those to Agora Christie and those will be forwarded on to me directly. And we'll navigate what we can with the time we have. But do remember at the end, at the 90-minute mark, Dr. Vasiliu will bring us together for a closing of the recorded time, at which point in time we have the pleasure of Dr. Brenton Dickinson leading us in a more open chat time. We'll pop on faces back on the
progress.
Screen. And do remember, folks, so I'm getting some feedback there, but do remember to mute right now too, if you can. That's helpful for us all. And I'm bad at, we've all messed up on that. So don't be overly embarrassed by forgetting to mute or accidentally unmuting. We've all done it, but try to keep that in your mind. And Dr. Dickinson will lead us in a general discussion at the 90-minute mark. But let's pull back to the beginning here and to the honor and delight I have in introducing you to three of our scholars today. And we have with us a theologian, a historian, and a literary scholar in our panel of experts, which is all too unusual of combination. Combination should happen much more often, I think. But today we are privileged to have Dr. Otniel Bunaciu, who studied under Professor Fiddes in Oxford when he was a student there, and then in turn became a professor of Dr. Denis Vasiliou. So we got an interweaving of relationships right from the beginning here. He is professor and also dean at the University of Bucharest, Romania, and he works in the Faculty of Baptist Theology. His research interests are in interdisciplinary areas such as religious studies and public policy, ethnography, theology, as well as the history of Christian thought, ethics, systematics, and leadership in the context of faith-based and cross-cultural environments. He additionally does research in comparative religion and Abrahamic religions. He has taught tertiary education as widely as Florida, Texas, Indianapolis, Austria, and Moldova. He serves as a member of the Ministry of Education in Romania. And besides his academic experience, because none of us are just academics, Professor Bunaciu has also been involved in the life and work of many faith-based communities and churches, more recently also working with Ukrainian refugees. In 1992, he founded a charitable work in Bucharest that serves and educates disadvantaged children, in particular those of the Roma culture. As a Baptist minister, he has served as the president of the Baptist Union of Romania and of the European Baptist Federation, leading the Department of Theology and Education. And he is the vice chair of the International Baptist Theological Study Center. He's a busy man. Bucharest is his home, and it is rumored that he not only has theological skills, but engineering ones as well, which is not a common mix. So welcome, sir. It is so wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Paul Michelson. We have to balance our two Dr. Pauls here. Dr. Paul Michelson is a distinguished professor of history emeritus at Huntington University in Indiana and a specialist on Romanian history since the 19th century. That is not that he's been a specialist since the 19th century, but it's Romanian history since the 19th century, of which he is a specialist, I think. He has been 3 times a Fulbright Fellow in Romania, 3 times, and recognized in many different ways for his important contribution to Romanian studies. His writing has received numerous awards, such as Outstanding Academic Book in 1998 by the American Library Association for his work on Romanian politics, 1859 to 1871, and the 2000 Bunaciu Prize for History from the Romanian Academy for his work generally. Dr. Michelson is an honorary member of the Romanian Academy Institutes of History, I should say, plural, because he is an honorary member at the Institute in Iași, in Bucharest, and in Cluj, all 3. His other areas of interest and expertise include historiography, Romanian history in the 19th and 21st centuries, totalitarian and post-totalitarian societies, the history of Venice, and the writings of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and the Inklings. His most recent articles dealing with Inkling matters. I'm going to ask somebody who's accidentally unmuted. So if you could check to make sure you're muted again, that'd be great. Thanks. Dr. Michelson's most recent articles dealing with the Inklings are C.S. Lewis on Stories, C.S. Lewis Comes to Romania, 1977 to 2022, and W.H. Lewis, Biographical Excursus. And for those who don't know, W.H. Lewis is C.S. Lewis's brother. Dr. Michelson is currently a board member and a newsletter editor of the C.S. Lewis and Kindred Spirit Society of Central and Eastern Europe, and a founding participant in the Inkling Folk Fellowship. He's a key member there, I think I'm allowed to say. He also occasionally, only occasionally, is kept in line by a bevy of lovely grandchildren. So welcome, Dr. Michelson. My last introduction is to Dr. Sorina Higgins. And Dr. Higgins is editor-in-chief of the Signum University Press and also serves on Signum faculty. Her academic interests include British and Irish modernism, Lewis and the Inklings, Arthuriana, theater, magic, and eco-criticism. Dr. Higgins began a blog 10 years ago, which is quite a long time, devoted to a systemic study on the work of Charles Williams. And that blog was called The Oddest Inkling. It's hard for me to believe that it's 10 years ago. She continues work on that blog to this day. So it is probably, I think it's safe to say that it's become the biggest one-site resource on Williams focused material. So if you want to just kick off finding out more about Charles Williams, that blog, The Oddest Inkling, is a place to start. In 2016, Dr. Higgins wrote the introduction to a new edition of Williams' Taliesin through Logos, and she's also edited and introduced Williams' early play, The Chapel of the Thorn. Dr. Higgins is currently co-editing a volume on the ethical turn in speculative fiction with Dr. Brenton Dickinson. Sorina has, sorry, I was looking over to see if I have it, because usually it's sitting right next to me here on my desk, edited pretty important, it's back there somewhere, pretty important academic essay collection entitled The Inklings and King Arthur, J.R. Tolkien, Charles Williams, C.S. Lewis, and Owen Barfield on the Matter of Britain. And it won the 2018 Mythopoeic Society Inkling Scholarship Award. Her own scholarship, or her other scholarship, appears in the International Yeats Studies, the T.S. Eliot Studies Annual, the Inklings Journal 7, the Journal of Inkling Studies, Myth, Lore, etc. She's also a published poet, has a volume of short stories coming out soon as well. She doesn't sit still very long. I will add that she is also known within the world of Inkling scholarship for being a brilliant dancer, for being able to cook and bake whilst teaching online, and for her Zoom-friendly cats who may appear at some point in time today.
Thank you.
Not at all. Our speakers have various websites, Twitter handles, and other places online where you can find their work. And so I'm going to ask each of you guys if you would feel free to pop at some point in time, pop into the chat, link to your website or to your Twitter handle, or where you would enjoy sending folk, and that would be great. To introduce us to Charles Williams, and we'll just have to wait with bated breath for more information about Dr. Fiddes.
Sure, absolutely. And just as a transition in from this difficult time, this is something that happens in the Inklings community. Like I said, I haven't seen it on a Zoom before, but there have been 2 events recently that have stirred up the pots of hatred. One is the Rings of Power TV show, because they cast actors who were people of color in important roles. And then the second is a release of a pack of cards from Magic the Gathering, which depicts Aragorn as a Black man. And so the internet has just been washed in all of this. Just washed in all of this hatred for people who think that somehow the Inklings stand for a kind of narrow, bigoted idea of Christianity as being identified with whiteness. And obviously we believe that that is a completely incorrect reading of the Inklings. So while what we're going through right now is horrible, I think it's actually kind of relevant to see that this is what's going on in the community, and some of the actors who have played those roles received hate mail and death threats. But on the flip side, a whole generation of young people has been saying, wow, there's someone like me entering the Inklings community. It does not just belong to a very small subculture of people who are from a certain ethnic background or a certain economic background or speak a certain language, but no, these great writers and their myths belong to all of us. And so what you are doing here in your group is showing that the Inklings belong to all of us and that everyone has a place in these stories and these myths. So just wanted to say that by way of acknowledging what's going on here and in the larger picture. And there are some things in Charles Williams' life that show that he was trying to fit in to places that he felt maybe weren't welcoming. And so in some ways, his life is a story of trying to find how mythology can give meaning to those who feel like they don't belong. So Charles Williams was born in 1886 in a part of London, and lived there until he was just a little boy, and then moved out into what was then the country in St. Albans. But his family had financial trouble all along. His father lost his job early on because he was losing his eyesight, and then started a little shop selling artist supplies, which was not extraordinarily successful. So the Williams family struggled to make ends meet. And as a result, young Charles was not able to complete a university degree. He went to university for about a year with something that we in the United States would probably call dual enrollment. I'm not sure what you would call it there, but it's when someone who is still in secondary school is able to attend university for their last year and take courses for credit. But then he was only able to get like another semester's worth or so of education before his family could no longer afford it. And this was difficult for Williams throughout his life. He did not have the Oxford degree that so many of his friends had, but he was brilliant, hardworking, and dedicated, and went on to learn as much as any of them did, if not more. And one of the ways he did this was through his workplace. In 1908, I think it was, he got a little job as a proofreader at the Oxford University Press in their London branch. And I think he was proofreading the complete works of Trollope. But from there, he then worked his way up until he became one of the senior editors of that branch of the Oxford University Press. And his editorial work there gave him a position whereby he could shape the literary tastes of the times, because he wrote many introductions about authors, essays about them, a couple of works of his own literary criticism discussing poetry in his own time. And he also edited anthologies and collections. So by means of the works that he published and discussed and introduced, he was able to help people learn more about literature of the time. And he also taught at, again, to use the US terms, almost like a community college or an adult continuing education program, whereby working people went in the evenings to the City Literary Institute and took classes on literature. But he taught there as if he were among the greatest Oxford dons of them all, just quoting vast swaths of classic poetry as he paced up and down the floor, and treating these authors as real people and their ideas as if their ideas mattered essentially. So some of these students had never seen literature come to life the way he brought it to life. So those are some of the ways that he impacted his time period. And remember, all this time he's in London. He is not yet a member of the Inklings. Now, I'll mention another important part of his life and formation before we get to the Inklings. And that is, in 1917, he joined one or possibly two secret societies. And these secret societies practiced mysticism and ceremonial magic and believed in a secret body of spiritual knowledge. So they studied this spiritual knowledge intensely. And this was, I believe, one of the ways that Williams and some of his contemporaries tried to find a place of belonging. Because as I said, he didn't have a college degree, so he felt a little bit marginalized from academia. Also at that time, women could not get degrees. And so many women took leadership positions in these societies. And at that time also, there were not very many Christian denominations where women could be in positions of leadership, but they could in these alternative spiritual communities. So I think a lot of people joined these to give themselves a sense of belonging and of purpose, and to learn this vast field of spiritual knowledge. And there also were, I think, some dangers in these groups, that they appealed to people who love power and love control. And Dr. Fiddes deals with those issues very, very, very well in his magnificent book, dealing very carefully with the distinctions of what was going on there. So you can tell from this that Williams was a person who loved literature, to whom ideas were vivid and alive, for whom the spiritual world was present and relevant and active, and to whom knowledge and community and also the elements of high ceremony were very important. In 1939, when London was being bombed during the beginning of the war, his branch of the Oxford University Press was evacuated from London to Oxford. And so there he was able to join the Inklings. Now, as Paul also covers in great detail in his book, Williams and Lewis had already met by letter and had been corresponding for a few years at this point and had met occasionally in London or Oxford. But now Williams was there, living in Oxford, often making use of C.S. Lewis's rooms, and had 6 years there at the end of his life of intense, fulfilling fellowship that led to his flourishing even more as a writer. So even though his major ideas had been formed by 1939, that community there was very good for him. He wrote in a letter that they are good for my mind. And I don't think he had had very many people who could keep up with him intellectually till that point, and not very many people who could challenge his ideas and push him to think more clearly and write more clearly, because his writing is beautiful, profound, but not exactly clear and easy, shall we say. And Lewis pushed him to try to be more lucid in his prose. So they had 6 years of really fantastic fellowship until Williams died quite unexpectedly, and fairly young, early 50s, 1 week after victory declared in Europe, from an illness that could be traced all the way back to his childhood. Quite a sudden illness and a sudden death. And it was most unfortunate because he was flourishing. Then he had been given an honorary degree by Oxford and been made a lecturer in Oxford, and had these long-term plans for taking his poetry that he'd written so far and putting it into a long narrative cycle. And he saw a future ahead of him that he had always longed for, of being an established scholar, teacher, and writer, of bringing all of his skills together, and then was cut off from that by this unexpected death. Now, I'm sure we'll get into some of his themes and topics and books as we go on, but you should just know that the legends of King Arthur were extremely important to him, and he saw the image of the Grail as a very important symbol of our relationship to God and as an object that reveals our spiritual condition. And he had an intensely sacramental vision in which everything we experience here in this material world is an index to the divine, including the human body and the rituals that we perform. So I can probably leave it there, Kirstin, unless there's anything else specific. I haven't talked about the co-inherence because I know we'll get into that in discussing Paul's book. So how's that?
That's fantastic, Sorina. Thank you. And we'll pull you back into some other things later too. So that's brilliant. And that gives us a bit of a sense of this one teacher in Oxford some decades ago, someone who actually taught people in Oxford, even if he wasn't an Oxford hat student. And we're gonna let us segue that to another Oxford teacher who is an Oxford professor, and that is Dr. Fiddes, Professor Fiddes. And I believe that Professor Bunaciu is able to join us again. I think that's going to work. Yes, I see him. It's going to work this time. And he's going to introduce us to Professor Fiddes, and doing it this way will just help you start to think through, like, as we get to know who Professor Fiddes is, what is it that drew this man to the man that Sorina just described to us?
Thank you again, Kirstin, and I'm sorry about this. I changed computers, and on my laptop I have a virtual private network, so I hope that this time we won't be able to be hacked. Anyway, so I was just saying that I have a great regard for Professor Fiddes because he was very helpful not only to me but to many students, and he has a special place in Romanian theological development and with the University of Bucharest. Professor Fiddes is Professor of Systematic Theology at the University of Oxford and is a Fellow of the British Academy. He's also the Principal Emeritus and Senior Research Fellow at Regent's Park College in Oxford. He's a former Chairman of the Oxford Faculty of Theology and has initiated some research project. The latest, I think, is the project for the study of love in religion, and these are part of the research programs at Regent's Park College. He's also a member of the Bucharest academic community since 2004, when he was awarded the title of Doctor Honoris Causa. And he's been coming here regularly, helping develop our research in Bucharest. Paul Fiddes is also an ordained minister of the Baptist Union of Great Britain and has been involved in various ecumenical work and dialogues between Baptists and other Christian traditions on behalf both of the European Baptist Federation and the Baptist World Alliance. Besides his significant and widely recognized contribution to theology, Fiddes is also one of the leading scholars of theology and literature. I want to mention some of his important theological work to give some background to this, because I think, first of all, Paul thinks of himself as a theologian, although his interests are wide, and his academic range is equally significant. One of his important works is Past Event and Present Salvation, the Christian Idea of Atonement, a very significant presentation of atonement. Then another one is The Creative Suffering of God, which really represents a major contribution to theology, and also a book to which I will come back at the end of my presentation, Participating in God, a Pastoral Doctrine of the Trinity. In the interdisciplinary area, which I mentioned, his most recent books include More Things in Heaven and Earth, Shakespeare Theology and the Interplay of Texts, Aris Murdoch and the Others, a writer in dialogue with theology, and of course the book we are discussing this evening, here in Romania this evening, Charles Williams and C.S. Lewis, Friends in Co-Inherence. Also in 2018, some of you may know this, Paul Fiddes published his first novel, A Unicorn Dies, a novel of mystery and ideas, which is very exciting book, which I really liked because it reminded me of my time in Oxford. In the current volume, while presenting the friendship of the two of the Inklings, C.S. Lewis and Charles Williams, Paul Fiddes also engages with their writings from the perspective of a theologian, but with a clear and precise analysis and scholarship. This brings to the readers resources from some unpublished material, which includes lecture notes from 1930, taken by a friend and student of Williams by name Raymond Hunt, whom Fiddes describes as his most faithful listener. And I think this belonged to, if I remember correctly, from the Wade collection. So it's something which has not been very much explored about Williams. The texts enable Fiddes to bring some new references that widen the context for understanding Williams. For example, in a chapter about Williams and Karl Barth, and also about Williams and William Blake. By developing these insights, Fiddes engages with the concept of co-inherence and demonstrates its importance for the thought both of Lewis and Williams. Although the idea of co-inherence may not seem as important for Lewis's thought, Fiddes does explain how the great dance from Perelandra is an extended metaphor, in fact, for the co-inherence for which Lewis, which is reflecting in some way the dance of the tarot, figures in Williams's novel, The Greater Trumps. It's interesting because Fiddes notes the influence of one friend over the other, not only in similarities, but also in the distinction, the differences in their understanding of this concept. So while exploring the importance of the concept of co-inherence for Williams, and I would like to allow Paul to speak to us about this, Fiddes suggests that Williams seems to have acquired it from reading prestigious book, God in Patristic Thought, a book which was very influential in patristic theology, published in 1936. Although Williams uses that word in 1939 in the publication of The Descent of the Dove. Fiddes points out that Prestige uses the word co-inherence for the Greek word perichoresis to suggest that the relationship between the divine person in the Trinity is that they mutually contain each other or envelop each other or interpenetrate each other. Perichoresis was also understood as movements, not unlike a dance, expressing the relationship between the divine person in the Trinity. I say this because Fiddes' detailed explanation of co-inherence and how it relates to his development in patristic thought of the doctrine of Trinity reflects his own contribution to developing a doctrine of Trinity. So I think this is probably an important connection between co-inherence and Paul Fiddes' interest in this term. This brief introduction cannot do justice to the way he introduces the doctrine of Trinity in his book, Participating in God, a Pastoral Doctrine of the Trinity, in which he presents an image of the perichoresis of the Trinity as movements of a dance, where we can speak of the divine persons in the Trinity as relations. This way of thinking about the relationships in the Trinity enables us to use participatory rather than observational language when we speak about entering the relational movements of the triune God. As Fiddes himself explains it, this has the reality of participation, which is just as concrete as the immediate communion within and between local churches. So this would be interesting for me to hear how Williams also thought about what Paul says about Williams thinking about practicing carrying each other's burdens, for example. Well, I want to close by saying, besides bringing many insights of the friendship between Lewis and Williams, the book also leads us to reflect of the importance of the concept of co-inherence for Christian theology and faith. And I must say, I come from a non-English speaking background, so I haven't heard about, I learned English when I was 16, and I haven't heard about Williams. So this has been an exciting journey for me. Well, I heard his name as one of the inklings, but it was not on my reading list. So it has been an exciting journey for me, and one that has reconnected me with Paul Fiddes' thoughts. So for this, I'm very grateful. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm chatting away to myself here. I hadn't realized I hadn't unmuted. Thank you, Dr. Bunaciu, for that. That your introduction for us to Professor Fiddes really sets us up perfectly, I think, for Dr. Michelson's introduction to his work, and pulling us from that person into this particular text that he has now crafted. So, Dr. Michelson, I can't see you on my screen, but I'm sure you are there somewhere. Oh, there you are. Would you like to take us from where Dr. Bunaciu has taken us into this particular work of Professor Fiddes's?
Right. Since most of you probably haven't had access to Dr. Fiddes's book, my assignment was to provide for us a kind of précis of what I consider a unique and important work. So here goes. Study is divided into 5 parts. Some of these have been alluded to already by Oti, but repetition won't hurt us. First part discusses the secret road of friendship shared by Charles Williams and C.S. Lewis. This was the road of romanticism. Since Williams was coming from the realm of eros, passion, and mysticism, and Lewis from the region of Sehnsucht, that is longing, it is clear that in the course of this relationship, each, as Dr. Fiddes points out, were both influenced by the other and will resist being influenced at the same time. Dr. Fiddes's back to the sources approach, which I think Lewis would have admired, helps us here to see the affinities and differences between them that could not otherwise be seen. That's a quote. For Lewis, the relationship between human and divine love was an analogy, while for Williams, quote from Dr. Fiddes, there was an actual participation of the human lover in the eternal love of God, end quote. Dr. Fiddes knows that Lewis often finessed this difference by reinterpreting Williams' ideas. However, in the final chapter in this section, he argues that following Williams' untimely death in 1945, Lewis moved closer to Williams' positions in the latter years of his life. Moving on to part two, this is an elaboration of the idea of coherence in the works and worldviews of Lewis and Williams by considering the way or ways of exchange between them. Dr. Fiddes has a very clear and helpful discussion of the evolution of Williams' thought from 1924 onward concerning romantic theology, then the concept of substitution and exchange, and finally arriving in 1939 at the concept of co-inherence, which for him involved a kind of erotic mysticism fused with sacramentalism. Then our author develops the idea of co-inherence, or the evolution of this, in the work of C.S. Lewis, particularly as it involved longing and the importance of myth and analogy. It also involved the rejection of participation in the religion of love called for by Williams. In fact, in his 1936 Allegory of Love, Lewis had clearly denounced the religion of love as, quote, no more than a parody of real religion. This rejection, as I mentioned, gradually softened as time went on. Dr. Fiddes also calls rightly attention here to Lewis's declaration in 1940 that both Sehnsucht, his way, and romantic love, Williams' way, were, quote, sub-Christian values and worthwhile only as limited ways of bringing people to Christ. They were not spiritual virtues, Lewis argued, because, quote, cultural activities do not in themselves improve our spiritual condition. An important warning, I think. Third part, collaboration and co-inherence, is a case study of Williams and Lewis's co-inherence and friendship by looking at their work on Arthurian literature. The conclusion that Fiddes draws here is, again, divergencies as well as convergences existed between Williams and Lewis. I would also like to point out that our writer's exposition of Williams' complex, almost incoherent Arthurian poetry actually makes sense to non-specialists. Part 4, further studies in co-inherence, examines how Williams and Lewis used co-inherence across multiple genres and how understanding this makes a salient difference in our readings of these works. By far the longest and most diverse part of Fiddes's book, and includes studies of Williams and William Blake, Williams and Karl Barth, Lewis and Thomas Traherne, and examples of the novels of Williams and of Lewis's Perelandra. There's something new here for almost every imaginable reader. Finally, in part 5, Theology of Co-Inherence, Fiddes takes a closely reasoned theological and historical look at co-inherence. He tries to establish a common ground between Williams and Lewis's frameworks of reality. Then he reviews, as Oti has already mentioned, co-inherence as a theological concept, beginning with the work of G.L. Prestige on perichoresis, a concept which goes back to Gregory Nazanian. This includes the idea of the co-inherence of the Trinity, an approach, Dr. Fiddes says, can shake us free from a metaphysic of two natures. He also provides a nuanced survey of the use of the concept in theology following Williams' death, particularly in the work of T.F. Torrance. At the end of part 5, Dr. Fiddes returns to a discussion of a possible reconciliation between Williams and Lewis's views of the relationship between human and divine love, what is seen by Williams as participation and as analogy by Lewis. We need to recognize, he points out, that Lewis was, quote, indebted to Christianized Neoplatonism and Williams to a Christianized Kabbalism, end quote, an important insight. Dr. Fiddes argues that continued examination of what could be called, quote, impossible possibilities, end quote, might be fruitful. For example, quote, analogy constantly becomes participation in literature, especially poetry, where, as Lewis asserted in Mere Christianity, the whole dance or drama is to be played out in each one of us. Précis of such a deep book of impeccable scholarship can't, of course, do it justice, but I think hopefully I've suggested some of the riches that can be found on every page. You'll have to read it for yourself. I think it would be well worth your time and effort. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Michelson. I can't help but think that it must be a little odd, Professor Fiddes, to sit here and have all these people on the screen hearing you described, being told what you think and what you've done and what you've accomplished, and then being told what your book is about and what it does, and obviously in a delightful and appreciative manner. And yet you're sitting and receiving this. And so I think I'd like to segue us into a bit of a question time, asking you this is sort of a double-handled thing. I'd love to hear more about how you discovered Williams, how you came to Williams, how Williams began to co-inhere in some manner in Fiddes. But then also, if beyond that or within that, you could give us a little bit of your thoughts on, is there anything you'd like to finesse further on what's been said thus far? I guess is kind of what I'm also wondering at the same time. But please, can you introduce us to your introduction to Williams and why he intrigued you so much that now, at that point in time, 2022, you end up writing this book on him. Substantial.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation and for everyone who's collaborated so far in an event that I've been very much enjoying, and indeed for everyone on screen, because you really do exemplify co-inherence. Co-inherence is about connectedness, it's about mutual indwelling. It's about an interweaving of one life with another. And here we are on the screen with a co-inherence in cyberspace. So it's very good to be part of this event. Well, Kirstin's asked me how, as it were, I started reading Williams, but I'd want to say it's Williams and Lewis, which after all is what the book is about. And I've been reading them both for more than 65 years, in fact. I started reading C.S. Lewis when I came across his Chronicles of Narnia, but I came across them when they were just more or less being published. I well remember seeing The Last Battle in a shelf of new books, which had just been published in my local children's library. So about the age of 8, I read all the Narnia stories, and they really unlocked imagination for me. I didn't know that C.S. Lewis was a Christian. No one told me that. No one told me who he was. I just came across the books and lived in the world of Narnia. And later, of course, I did make the connection with the Christian story. And then at the age of 11, I happened to pick up a novel by someone called Charles Williams. He wrote these 7, what are often called supernatural shockers about the place of the spiritual world in the physical world around us. And I found one of these called Many Dimensions in my school library. And then I read all of them. And from that point on, I didn't know at the time that he was connected to Lewis in any way. But from that time onwards, really, both Lewis and Williams have accompanied me in all my thinking, both about literature and about theology. And I think that Williams' idea of co-inherence has in fact shaped my theology of the Trinity that Dr. Bunaciu has so graciously referred to. And certainly, I think reading them gave me the impulse to be interested in the interface between literature and theology. Literature was in fact my first discipline, and I did teach it for a while. I'm now a specialist as a theologian, but very interested in the way that the worlds of theology and literature overlap. So that's really how I came into both Lewis and Williams. And as Kirstin so brilliantly put it, they co-inhered, as it were, in me and in my life. And I think that's right. I've been reading them alongside everything I've been doing for the last 65 years or so. And because of my age, I was able to read a lot of the work of Lewis as it came out, not just the Narnia stories, but his later works as well. So it is in that sense part of my life. Now, what Kirstin has asked, would I like to add? Well, many thanks to Dr. Michelson for such a competent and extraordinary, really, summary of a book of over 400 pages. I really couldn't have done it better myself. In fact, I don't think I'd have done it anywhere near as well. So many thanks to him. But he did underline, while he was giving us this account, that really we've got two different world views going on here. And those familiar with Lewis know that he was very influenced by Neoplatonism, and so saw really human experience and human love in particular as an analogy of the divine and divine love, and there being a kind of ladder of ascent between us and the world of the divine and God's own being, and was rather worried about too much fusion between the divine and the human. Whereas Williams thought of human life, and particularly human love, as participating in the life of God. And so they did come at this question of human-divine relation from really quite different angles. And Williams was very influenced, as already been pointed out, by reading this Jewish mystical philosophy of the Kabbalah, in which there are many gateways to the glory of God in the world and in human life. Whereas for Lewis, this was rather more transcendent. But the interesting thing is, this is part of the argument of the book that perhaps hasn't quite come out, when it came to co-inherence, Lewis, in fact, thought that once one had the new life from God through Christ, Zoe, new life, not just physical life, there was a deep participation in the life of the Trinity, that we could join the dance of the Trinity. And he said this in Mere Christianity. Whereas for Williams, although he saw all human life as co-inhering in the life of Christ, whom he thought was almost born again in human love, he tended to see this as an analogy of the Trinity. So there's a kind of crossways movement here as far as divine and human love in general is concerned, you know, what human life is like. Lewis said, no, it's just an analogy, whereas Williams said, no, it's really participation in particularly in the life of Christ. Is sacramental, in fact, as Paul pointed out. But then, for Lewis, once human life was renewed by God, there seems to be a deeper participation in the life of the Trinity than you actually get in Williams. So they are very complementary in that way. And part of the argument of the book is to try to trace these differences and this convergence between them. So I don't know if you want to follow any of that up, Kirstin.
I mean, I could be greedy and just keep you all to myself with questions here. I'm going to ask you one more question here, that of the many things that are popping off my brain, and then I'm going to allow Sorina and the other speakers to ask you a couple questions. But hearing you describe your understanding of coherence as envisioned or understood by each of Williams and Lewis, and your clear enjoyment of the concept and the beauty of the concept, the parachoretic nature of it all. Can you remember when the idea, the concept of co-inherence first really struck you, and when it moved you so much that you wanted to delve time into it? What about it made you personally go, this is really important. This is important for me. This is an idea that I think is really important to help people understand better. Because there's lots of ideas Lewis plays with. I mean, it is a key concept for Williams, but still it's a word that many people have never heard of before. And I could talk about why the idea is exciting for me, and my excitement when I first heard you lecture on this in Romania and give a brilliant lecture on this concept in Romania. But for you, what did it grab for you? What's the personal part for you, and why are you so keen for people to get it?
Right. Well, first of all, I could say it is an unusual word. And as Otniel Bunaciu has pointed out, it was really made more popular in English by this writer in early church thinking called Prestige, and he used it to translate the Greek word perichoresis, which was a word used to describe the way the persons of the Trinity interact with each other, interweave with each other, interpenetrate each other. And he translated this into English as co-inherence. The word had been used before, but not very much at all. He really made it more popular. And William seems to have picked it up from him. So though it's an unusual word, what it expresses, which is a mutual indwelling, an interweaving, an interpenetration, a mutual indwelling, of course, is really at the heart of all of human life, and certainly at the heart of the Christian gospel. So it's not just the word, it is what it expresses. And of course, there are other words that you can use to express this reality. And the word that I use most is actually participation rather than co-inherence. The book I wrote on the Trinity is called Participating in God. A lot of feminist theologians actually prefer the idea of interconnection or connectedness, and want to revive that sense that we are truly all interconnected with one another, and not just human beings, but the whole of the natural world. Interconnection runs throughout the cosmos. Christians want to say that this is because we're all interconnected in God, and know that through Christ. So I would say it's not so much this particular word, it's what it expresses really in terms of an interconnected life, a life of mutual indwelling. When, as it were, the word co-inherence itself became part of this, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I read William's book, The Descent of the Dove, in which he says a lot about co-inherence very early on in my life, and certainly in my early 20s. So, I was certainly familiar with that, and I suspect it had a lot more influence on me than perhaps I can actually trace in any sort of documentary way. But I look back not long ago at a doctoral thesis I wrote in my mid-20s, and I see that the word participation is quite central there, and I suspect that it did have something to do with Williams and co-inherence, but exactly what it is more difficult to say, I think. Thinking, by the way, of what someone mentioned about, as I just mentioned, my early doctoral work about descent, scholastic descent, as it were. I calculate that Dr. Vasiliou must be the 5th generation from Lewis, because when I went up to Oxford in 1965, I was in the first batch of undergraduate students taught by Francis Warner, an extraordinarily creative man, poet, playwright, and very fine teacher of literature. And he was the last graduate student of C.S. Lewis. And in fact, I say something about that in the last chapter of the book, about his insights actually into Lewis's worldview. So there we have C.S. Lewis, we have Francis Warner. He taught me. I had the privilege at some point of teaching Dr. Bunaciu, and now he has been the supervisor for Dr. Vassiliou. So there we are. We are all co-inhering, I think.
Mm-hmm. And all co-participating. Before I hand you, Sorina, I'm really prepping you here, Sorina. I'm aware that some of us are very familiar with the language and what you mean by participating with the Trinity, but some people, this concept or phrase will be very unfamiliar. Could you just really briefly explain what you mean by participating in the Trinity?
Well, sharing in the life and the love of God. I mean, sharing would be another word that you could use, which perhaps be more popular. But it is such a deep sharing that is a mutual indwelling, and that, of course, is the word used in John's Gospel, when Jesus talks about the way that he dwells in the Father and the way that his disciples dwell in him and in the Father, and indeed in the Spirit. So this idea of a mutual indwelling is right there in John chapter 17, that perhaps quite a lot of people might be familiar with. So mutual indwelling, sharing, living in, yes, that sort of idea is what participating is about. And as Dr. Bunaciu pointed out, I've been wanting to say that the more we think of relationships in God, the more we can think about that participation in God, because in our own everyday relationships, we find that these actually share in deeper relationships, more inexhaustible relationships that are not damaged in the way that ours are. And we're talking about relations in God. So that I think is something about the participating of ordinary human life in God that is very close to Williams, in fact. Yeah.
Thank you very much, because I think that's really important. Thank you. Dr. Higgins, over to you. What part of his brain would you like to pick?
Oh, I'd just like to continue this conversation, if that's okay, because it ties right into what I was curious about. Paul, how far do you think that sharing or participation in the life of the Trinity goes? And the reason I ask that is sort of, I would love to push you towards how orthodox, with a small o, do you think Williams was? Because from the secret societies that he was in with some of the Gnostic knowledge, there was an idea of becoming part of the divine, or even getting in touch with the divine within, becoming infiltrated by the Christ spirit. Do you think that Williams went too far in that direction, or do you think he remained firmly within Christian theology?
First of all, I just like to repeat what I said before, that for Williams, his key idea is really participating in the life of Christ. In our mutual dwelling in each other, particularly in love, we are dwelling in Christ. Mm-hmm. It was Lewis who really took that much further in terms of participation in the life of the Trinity. Mm-hmm. I mean, Williams saw this mutual indwelling in human life, this interdependence and this dwelling in Christ, then as being analogous to the way that there is a mutual Indwelling in the Trinity. I mean, his book, Figure of Beatrice, is largely about that analogy, but he saw this happening in all of human everyday life, whereas for Lewis, you did need to be born anew of a new life from God in order to enter into this life in the Trinity. That is, I think, a considerable difference between them. But then this, as it were, this Christ mysticism, you're saying, is it orthodox, as it were? Well, yes, I think it is actually orthodox. perhaps in the strict sense of Eastern Orthodox, in the sense that all human life is revivified by the life of Christ. There is the Eastern Orthodox idea of theosis, of divinization, in which human life has been forever changed by the incarnation of Christ, and everyone is in some way involved in that, though they may not realize it consciously. And then he had this idea that may seem outrageously esoteric and mystical, that in the love between two people, Christ is, as it were, reincarnated or reborn into the world. And yet, very orthodox poets like Gerard Manley Hopkins spoke about the possibility of there being new births of Christ in us and through us, new Nazareths, he said, that we could, as it were, birth Christ into the world. We could become the means by which Christ could share deeply in people's lives. So that sort of idea, though it does have, for Williams, a lot of background in mystical thinking, and those ceremonial rites that you talked about. Nevertheless, it does touch at many points on what I'd say is Christian orthodoxy.
Yeah. Okay, well, you've kind of anticipated my next question then, which was, how would Williams recommend we go about practicing this co-inherence in our lives, or even deepening our conscious awareness and participation, awareness of and participation in it? Are ceremonies essential there? Certain practices?
Well, Williams really left behind that kind of ceremony from about 1927 onwards. I think he felt that he got all he could from these groups that you mentioned that he was connected with. So I don't think that he would have recommended particular ceremonies apart from those of the Christian Church. I mean, he was born and continued and remained a devout Anglican, and would have thought that Eucharistic ceremonies were a very important way, in fact, of experiencing this co-inherence. But he did have another spiritual practice, which was he called substitution, which you obviously know about, Sorina, but perhaps others don't. And Otti has referred to this when he talked about bearing one another's burdens. He thought that it was possible to take someone else's mental anguish and pain upon oneself and to carry it for them. And because it wasn't your own particular suffering and pain, that in fact it would be easier for you to carry it than the other person. So this mutual sharing in each other's pain and suffering, certainly mental, perhaps physical, but that's a little less certain really in Williams, I think, was a spiritual practice that he asked those who were his close friends to practice on behalf of others. He'd draw their attention to someone who was in need and say, well, could you carry their burden for them, in fact? Enter empathetically into their experience, and that this would really make a difference.
Yeah. Now, as much as I hesitate to push back to someone like yourself, Paul, may I push back on that just a little bit? From my reading, he continued in at least one of these societies until the late 30s and continued practicing certain types of ceremonial rituals with his disciples. And then in his quite late poem, The Founding of the Company, he shows 3 different levels of participation. The first is the unconscious. Just by nature of being human and being born, you can simply say, I'm okay being in fellowship with others and I'm okay serving them, whether you know it comes from divine source or not. The second level is being conscious of the spiritual nature of this co-inherence. And the third is the intense awareness and the heightened mystical sense that by substitution exchange, you can actually save other people's souls. And in the late 30s and until his death, he was prescribing these actions, as you say. He did have this group, and he would tell people to at least create contracts or compacts with one another. So that's not exactly the same as a ritual, but there was something prescribed about it. What do you think of that?
Yes, well, I agree with you, of course, that I'm not sure we haven't really said the same thing, you know, in that what were fairly esoteric, mystical rituals became a way of life in which you could proceed through these three levels of exchange, the kind of interdependence we all know with each other from day to day in society, and then to substitution, where consciously you carried, as it were, the weight of another. And then finally, actually, the third level he did name co-inherence. So you do get this kind of, it looks a bit like a ladder, but he doesn't seem within his group of friends or the companions of the co-inherence. He formed this, as you know, this kind of lay religious group. He doesn't seem to have given people levels, as it were, to say, well, you are at the level of exchange, you are at the level of substitution, you are at the level of co-inherence, which would be typical of the kind of esoteric societies that he knew in his youth, where you attained a certain grade, as it were. So I think that's really what I wanted to say, that he didn't carry on that kind of grading or hierarchy from the initiate,
Absolutely,
to the adept.
Absolutely agree.
Yeah, but there's no evidence that he ever classified his friends or the companions of the co-inherence or his household, rather like the household of the poet Taliesin that you get in the poems. He didn't classify them in that way, you know, that you've reached a certain level, you've reached a higher level. Whereas in his early rituals, he himself went through many levels like that, as you know, corresponding to different gateways, Sephiroth in the Kabbalah. Is that fair enough? Would you agree about that?
I absolutely agree about that. That as he went along, he democratized his
Yeah,
idea.
you could say that's a good way, very good way of putting it. I mean, I think these were still very meaningful to him, what he learned in his early years. You probably know the story that after he died, his friends went to his room in order to find his ceremonial magical sword and to bury it, because they thought it might have some impact on his reputation if people knew, you know, he had these ceremonial objects. And as far as I know, it is still buried in that garden in Oxford, where, you know the story, I'm sure.
Go ahead.
No one's ever found it anyway. So, but he certainly still had that ceremonial sword up to the time of his death.
Yeah, and used it. Yeah, no, I
absolutely used it. Yes, he did. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Got rid of the grades, got rid of the initiation ceremonies, and got rid of the vows of secrecy too, and turned more to the exoteric statements of the gospel.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, I see that Paul wants to come in, but one more question that you deal with so well in your book relates to all of this. I often get asked, well, what does it matter what the man did in his life? We're looking at his books. You don't want to commit the biographical fallacy. You know, why does it matter what practices he did? What we're looking at is the literature. And I think you address that very well in the book. Do you want to share that now?
Well, I do say it's essentially a book about a literary relationship rather than being biographies, though inevitably you have to say, you must say something about the life, because the life connects all the books. And I think, you know, what is partly extraordinary about Williams is his range. I mean, he writes literary criticism, and he was more known for that than Lewis was for many years. I mean, you mentioned all the introductions he wrote to books and his editing job, which was, I think, so important, as you yourself said, for introducing people to contemporary writing. He wrote these 7 novels, he wrote books of popular theology, and I think his life in that sense is important for us, that it does connect all these different literary deposits up, rather, as I think might be true of Lewis, who again had an amazing range of writing. So I think the biography is important and also in showing and exploring the way that each had an impact on the work of the other. I think you have to understand their friendship to know that. But the book is not essentially biographical. It's about their works. I suppose partly because I have lived with their works for so long, whereas I didn't know either of them personally, though I had hoped to meet Lewis. He only died 2 years before I went to university, and I'd always thought that I would certainly meet him in Oxford. But alas, I was not to do so. Yeah.
Yes. Did you meet Owen
Though
Barfield?
I did meet very many of his friends and students, including the Anglican clergyman who married him, whom I taught a course on Karl Barth with for 10 years. So that's an interesting link. He told me all about his experience of marrying Lewis when Joy was in hospital from his point of view. Yeah.
And did you meet Owen Barfield, whose grandson is here with us today?
No, I didn't meet Owen Barfield, but I have met Owen Barfield's grandson, and indeed enjoyed being with him on that conference in Yash that
Thank
Dr.
you. I know Paul
kindly brought together. Has that answered the question?
Yes, yes, and more than most writers, Williams wrote his life into his work and his work into his life,
Yes.
and both into the lives of those with whom he was in fellowship. I mean, he gave them names of characters in his mythology. He gave them roles to play. Literally, he wrote plays for them, casting them as parts in his mythology. Yeah.
Indeed, yes. All this, for those who don't know, took place at the Oxford University Press, which he really turned into his own kind of way of life, really. And so, yes, there was this deep intersection between the literary work he was doing and his daily life, in fact. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I know that Paul wants to come in too, so I'll stop taking up more than my fair share. Thank you, Dr. Fiddes.
So my question relates to the influence session or intersection. And I think, especially for those who don't have a copy of the book, I wonder if you could share with us your major takeaway that your reading of Williams brings to our understanding of Perelandra.
Right, well, there's this extraordinary last chapter in Perelandra, a long chapter of this dance that goes on for a year, in which Ransom has this vision of everything in the universe interconnecting, and at the center is the God who is the creator of all this, and everyone, therefore, when they're related to this creator God, is themselves at the center. It's an extraordinary vision of the great dance of the cosmos. And as you read this, you recognize that that God, in fact, the triune God, is joining in this dance and moving in the measures and paces of this dance, connecting everything together. And that may not seem an extraordinary vision, but of course it is if you're brought up on classical Christian theology, in which God doesn't move at all. I mean, God is the unmoving center of everything. Everything moves around God. God isn't allowed to change. God isn't allowed to move from one phase of experience to another. This is classical theism. And so although everything dances round God in the early fathers of medieval writing, God isn't actually dancing in God's self. So this vision, I do think, was quite largely influenced by Williams, who in his book, The Greater Trumps, has the creator figure on the chessboard moving. People say, "Oh well, this figure doesn't move; everything else moves around it." These chess pieces dance. For those who haven't read the book, and somehow the whole of the cosmos is involved within this dance. But there's one figure that doesn't move, and of course that is the classical picture of God. God is the unmoved mover. God moves everything, but God in God's self doesn't move. And that's given rise to all sorts of pictures of a God who doesn't in fact suffer with the world, and a God who somehow seems remote and indeed somewhat dictatorial. And Williams is undermining this by having several of his characters seeing this piece moving. Yes, it does move. And this is what Lewis has really taken up into this last chapter of Perilandra, the great dance of the cosmos, in which God, the creator God, is actually part of that movement. Lewis once said to Williams, everything in this chapter is due to you. And he certainly recognized that this was a profound source for his picture of this great dance. Does that begin to answer your?
Yeah, I think it makes it clear for those who haven't read your chapter. And I also think it's part of an insight into the usual thing that's said, which is that hideous strength was influenced by Williams. This is the first illustration of this, but you're showing, forget that hideous strength. We can go back to Perilandra and see Williams clear as day.
Yeah, it's always said that that hideous strength is a Williams novel under Lewis's name, and there's a great deal to be said for that, and I do explore that in the book. But yes, I think we go back one step, certainly to the end of Perilandra for Williams' influence. I mean, Lewis says in other places, for example, in his book The Discarded Image, that this classical picture of an unmoving God is actually extremely unhelpful, and says that his picture of God is much more of the good shepherd who goes out looking for the lost sheep. So a God who is in movement, a God who has a concern which is dynamic, not simply the remote uncaused cause of everything. He says that himself in this book on the medieval worldview, that he's critical of it in that way. So it's not just in this last chapter of Perilandra. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. And friends, because we got a little bit delayed, I'm going to give us, with our interruptions, I'm going to give us time for a question, last question from you, Dr. Bunaciu, to hit your former professor with, and then bring us to a close for the recording time. But if you'll forgive us for extending this just a little bit of time to fit in that last question because of all the schmas before, and then we'll have at least a half hour of our general chat time to bring all the other questions that you might have, through which Dr. Brenton Dickinson will navigate us.
Thank you very much. In fact, both my main questions were asked by my colleagues, but I do want to press Paul a little bit on this idea of God being not static, because I read I was very surprised by this, but in Paul's book, he quotes something by C.S. Lewis in Beyond Personality, where he writes something that in Christianity, God is not a static thing, not even a person.
Yeah.
But a dynamic, pulsating activity, a life.
Yeah.
How do we untangle this thing, not person, but alive, almost a kind of drama?
Yeah.
And then he ends almost like a dance, So
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
does this work in terms of language? I understand, but
Well, I mean, what Lewis is going to say is God is not an individual being like ourselves. God isn't simply an extension of a human being, but bigger and grander and more powerful. And of course, sometimes people do conceive of God in that way, and then you end up with the picture of the old man with the beard in the sky, as it were, as a projection simply of a human concept. But for Lewis, God was certainly personality. In fact, beyond all human personality, but still personal. So I think you need to distinguish between a personal being and person.
yes.
God is supremely personal for Lewis. What I've been wanting to say is that we can only talk about God in a way that draws us into God. We can't, and you said this yourself in your introduction, we can't observe God as if God is an object to be put under a microscope, or for that matter, a telescope. God is not an object of our knowing, because that would be to diminish God and give ourselves control over God. So any language we use about God has the function of drawing us into the life of God. So when you say that God is a pulsating life or a dance, you aren't saying, oh, I'm looking at God and I can now tell you what God is like. What you're saying is, by using these words, I am being drawn into that life. And into that deeply relational personal life that we call the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
And I like how this kind of language.
These are not objects that we can observe and classify. It's a participatory language, in fact.
Yeah. And I like very much how this is developed in ways of resisting models of dominance, which have come out from images of a static God, which.
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Paul.
Yes, I mean, of course, this raises the profound theological question for those who are interested, which is that isn't this somehow diminishing God to say that God is in some way changing all the time? Because movement involves change, you see, which is why classical theologians denied that God moves, because that would mean that God was changing, God's experience was changing. So how do we reconcile that with God as being the uncaused cause of everything? I think it all comes down to the kind of God that God wants to be. I mean, we know that God wants to be a creator God, and therefore to involve God's self in a world of change and development and dynamic relationality and interconnectedness. And we can't get behind that essential primal decision of God. We can't say to God, well, why didn't you be some other kind of God? One that fits more with my philosophy. That, by the way, is what essentially Karl Barth had to say about God, which is why I find it interesting that Williams actually gave a lecture on Karl Barth, and you'll find, which will surprise, I think, all Williams scholars who perhaps didn't know that, as they hadn't read the notebooks of Hunt. And he's just tremendously attracted by the idea in Karl Barth that God is always doing the impossible possible, or making the impossible possible. And part of that is precisely a God who really does enter into the movement and change of life.
Of course, Lewis has a lot to say about images.
Yeah.
That's all we have.
Yeah.
He points out. And secondly, of course, we should never mistake our image of God for God.
Yes.
And it all fits in very well with what you're saying.
Yes, but I think the next stage is, say, what those images do is to draw us into the life of God. They, in that sense, which is what, of course, all stories do. They draw us into another world.
Mhm.
So they are dynamic images in that way. Yeah. And he agreed with Williams that we needed both positive and negative images. Images that say, well, God is like what we know, but so much greater. And also God is not like what we know in many ways. So the positive and the negative way are both necessary in this use of images.
Affirmation and negation.
Yes.
Is there any plan to publish the notebooks of Raymond Hunt?
No, I don't know of any. And it is extraordinary that people don't seem to know they exist, actually. And people write about Williams without ever reading the notebooks. I find that quite extraordinary. Because if you want to hear the voice of Williams, the living voice of Williams, then this is the way to do it, because Hunt took down what he said verbatim. I mean, he didn't always totally understand it, and sometimes he didn't catch the words because Williams spoke so fast and so enthusiastically. So there are great gaps everywhere, but nevertheless, you do get some sense of what an extraordinary event it was to listen to Williams talking. Yeah, but it's partly because it is so patchy, really, that I think that that no one has actually managed to publish them. Hunt wanted them published.
Well,
he thought they would be.
I know a publisher who would be interested.
Ah, right. Well, you'll have to find someone who's willing to edit them then. And I'm afraid I'm not proposing to do that.
I can do that.
I think the other
someone.
I think the other value of Hunt's is that these were lectures Williams was giving to ordinary people.
Yes.
And therefore, I think refrained from some of the highly esoteric vocabulary that he used in his writings,
Yeah.
Which in other words makes it accessible to us as ordinary people.
Yeah. I mean, he gave these lectures from very small amounts of notes, because a lot of the preparatory notes still exist for these lectures. He gave Hunt often his set of notes, as well as Hunt providing what he actually said. And it's quite clear that a lot of it is extempore. And he does get sidetracked, one has to say, and he does go off into to enthusiastic rants about things and lose his grip on the subject. So there, but it gives you a good sense of being in the same room as Williams. Yeah. Yes, but absolutely. He, as Sorina pointed out, he wasn't able to have a full university education, and he set out to give education to those who were not able to go to university at all. I mean, these institute, local authority institute lectures he gave were for ordinary working people, as you say. Yeah.
Which is a beautiful legacy. Friends, this is the part that I hate most. It's because it's when I have to corral people in. But it doesn't mean our conversation has to end, but I do need to hand us over to Denise. So Denise, we are in your hands.
Well, thank you, Kirstin, for saving me from the role of stopping this conversation. It has been certainly wonderful, and what an amazing participation of all of you to build this story that helped us to understand the Charles Williams world better, and this relationship with Lewis, and mainly the relationship between their ideas and everything that you have just explained to us. Thank you so much. Of course, all this was based on the long, hard work of Dr. Paul Fiddes, who for so many years thought of all these things. And what a blessing that this understanding and these ideas have been written down by you and have been passed to us to help us to understand. And thank you to all the special guests. Thank you very much, Dr. Bunaciu, for it was wonderful to have you here and to hear your insights, and Dr. Paul Mickelson and Dr. Higgins. I just hope that we will have the chance to meet again. I take the opportunity to reinforce our strong invitation for Dr. Paul Fiddes to come as a keynote speaker for this year conference. Now that you talked about generations, we are celebrating 60 years since Louis died, but we are also celebrating 10 years since we started the adventure of building the C.S. Lewis Society. It would be just great for you to be with us, but for all of us to have a face-to-face reunion here in Iași. I really appreciate that actually a love for Romanian people is inviting us. It is so important for us from here to have you with love and sacrifice to serve us by sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you, Kirstin, for being such a great host under such difficult circumstances. And thank you to all of you who have attended and have been listening so diligently. I enjoyed looking at the names, and please stay and take the chance to connect, and we will continue to talk to each other for, as Kirstin said, as long as you can bear it, let's say.